After World War II, relations between the former Allies, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, broke down and brought about an era known as the Cold War, where the world was divided by politics and ideology into East and West.
I'm sorry, dude. It was a prank. It was a prank, man. It was a prank.
Welcome to our video on the Cuban nuclear missile crisis. To give you guys some insight, the Cuban nuclear missile crisis was a conflict between the USA, Cuba, and Russia. The USA was unhappy as Cuba, who they believed were their allies, began forming an alliance with Russia. This sparked an invasion by the USA on Cuba, and Russia employing nuclear weapons in Cuba. Now that you have a little bit of background knowledge, let's get into it. The tensions were high in 1946 as the end of the Second World War gave way to the Cold War. The former alliance between the USA and the Soviet Union crumbled, and the world entered a period of high alert as during the 1950s both sides began testing nuclear warheads, a technology developed towards the end of World War II. These tests were used to show how the opposing side the strength that their own country possessed. The world was on the verge of nuclear war.
The Cuban Missile Crisis became a potential war inducer. After a revolution led by Fidel Castro, Cuba started to make links with Russia, which America didn't want. This was understandable, as America was the ally who helped Cuba during the revolution. Cuba refused to stop making friends with the Russians, so the Americans invaded Cuba in hopes to stop them. They failed miserably, and Khrushchev seized the opportunity to station 40 nuclear warheads in Cuba as defense from future attacks. However, this was not his only goal. Khrushchev also wanted to use the warheads as bargaining chips to claim the currently NATO-controlled West Berlin. Khrushchev also wanted the USA to remove their Jupiter warheads stationed in Italy and Turkey, as they opposed a threat.
On the 14th of October of 1962, an American U-2 spy plane spotted the missiles in Cuba, and the president learns of the threat that lurks in Cuba. The American Executive Committee of the National Security Council thought that a full-scale invasion of Cuba would stop them from doing anything. However, Kennedy relayed to them that this would start a full-scale nuclear war which would end up in mutually assured destruction. On October 18th, Kennedy met up with the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, who assured him that the missiles were for defensive purposes only. America, fearing the worst, blockaded Cuba. However, they called it a quarantine, as a blockade would signify an initiation of war. Due to the blockade, ships carrying weapons to Cuba would have to turn around. The Americans, after having blockaded, moved up the alert level to DEFCON 3, which meant that they had started preparing for a conflict.
In a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, the Soviet ambassador refused to admit existence of any warheads in Cuba. However, the Americans had proof and showed the council the pictures of the warheads stationed in Cuba. At this point, America had raised its alert level to DEFCON 2, meaning that the country had started preparing for all-out war and advised their allies to do the same. There were some Soviet ships that attempted to challenge the blockade, however those two were turned around and sent home. Although both sides were on the verge of war, they had the decency to wait for diplomacy to succeed instead of blowing each other up. At this point, the conflict faced a stalemate, in which both sides were waiting for the other to make a move. The Soviets ended up making the first move when a Soviet spy informed Kennedy of a possibility for negotiations. The deal was that if the US promised not to invade Cuba and to lower the blockade, as well as remove their Jupiter missiles located in Turkey and Italy, in return, the Russians would remove their missiles in Cuba under supervision of the UN. In the midst of this, a U-2 spy plane was shot down by the Cubans. However, Kennedy decided not to elevate the conflict and did not react. Kennedy decided to ignore Khrushchev's offer since the US was planning to remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy anyway.
During this time, more incidents occurred at the blockade. A U.S. naval ship had to drop depth charges to warn a Russian submarine from trying to go any further than the line the Americans had set up. The Americans were unaware that this submarine was carrying nuclear torpedoes. Thankfully, they decided not to fire them, which was a good decision that probably saved millions of lives. Not only this, but another U-2 found itself in a sticky situation as it was escorted by 2 Russian MiGs out of Cuban airspace. Cuba/Russia and the USA were on the brink of war. Finally, the Americans and the Soviets came to an agreement. The Americans were to remove all of the missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, as well as remove the blockade. The Americans also pledged to leave Cuba alone after the warheads had been dismantled and were on their way home. The Russians agreed to remove all 100 tactical nukes stationed in Cuba as their contribution to the compromise. This crisis occurred essentially due to a breakdown of communications between the US and Russia, so they decided to establish the Moscow-Washington hotline in order to enable communication directly instead of second-guessing each other. Even after this success in communication, the Cold War was still doomed to go on.